Hello, everybody, and welcome into Commodity Culture, where we break down commodities markets, sound money principles, and geopolitics, all with the goal of making you a better investor in the commodities sector. My name is Jesse Day, and on this episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Doomberg to the program, the author of the Doomberg Substack, the number one paid finance newsletter on that platform, where he writes about energy analysis, financial markets, and geopolitics. We're going to hone in on the energy sector today and discuss why he thinks the US is set for a full-on kinetic war with Venezuela, with that region's massive untapped oil reserves being a prize the Trump administration simply can't ignore, along with breaking down the implications of the recent MOU signed between Russia and China that will send more natural gas to China via the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, gas that could have been flowing to Europe as that region descends into economic self-destruction. All of this and so much more ahead, so strap yourselves in for my conversation with Doomberg. Doomberg, it is great to have you back on Commodity Culture. I want to kick things off by discussing the Trump administration's aggressive stance towards Venezuela and its potential connection to energy. The U.S. has now obliterated 2 Venezuelan boats and all crew members aboard, claiming they were trafficking drugs to the United States, along with deploying a significant naval and aerial force to the Caribbean, a move that some think could signal a preparation for potential strikes inside Venezuela. How much, if any, of this is driven by American desires to access Venezuela's massive untapped oil and gas reserves, in your view?
Sure. First, Jesse, great to be back. Always enjoy our conversations. This is something we've been flagging for many months on the Substack. It's more than just Venezuela's energy. Right next door in disputed territory is, of course, as you know, Guyana, which is probably the fastest growing oil and soon to be natural gas hotspot in the world. All the majors have assembled there. But Venezuela itself is home to what many believe is the largest hydrocarbon resource in the world. Venezuela has the potential to be every bit the energy power that, say, Canada is. Canada is producing, 5 million barrels a day, plus or minus. Venezuela used to produce 4.5 million barrels a day of relatively heavy crude that is really amenable to being, sent to the U.S. Gulf Coast for refining. Chevron has a long history in Venezuela. They produce about 1 million barrels a day today. It's of course a basket case, an economic basket case post Chavez, and so we've long believed that Maduro's days were numbered. On the day that Trump was inaugurated, we put out a piece called "Misreading the Room," where we made the point that the track record of strongman dictators on the critical path of the supermajors is not a glorious one. And we suggested that perhaps Maduro avoid flying private because there's the long history of mysterious jet crashes in the oil and gas business. And last point is that whenever we hear drug cartels, you really have to replace that with energy pirates. So there's the interweaving of the Mexican cartels and the Colombian cartels and the Venezuelan cartels with the oil and gas business is far more comprehensive than many people understand. The cartels get billions of dollars a year in a sort of classic mafia style of taking a vig for right of way through territories that they control, pipelines in particular. They're sort of midstreamers, you might say. And so they intercept all manner of fuel shipments. There's a whole black market for diesel and gasoline and jet fuel. Way more criminality in the oil and gas space in Central and South America than is widely reported. And so when we hear the Trump administration say there's a war on the drug cartels, we really think it's a war on black market energy pirates.
The sponsor of today's episode is ARC Silver Gold Osmium. Owner Ian Everard is praised even by his competitors as one of the most honest and level-headed bullion dealers in the United States. They have some great prices. You can see some of them displayed right now on screen. Take advantage of these specials today by reaching out to Ian at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com. Make sure to tell him, of course, that Commodity Culture sent you. And now, back to the interview. So do you think there's a real risk of this potentially escalating into a full-on, involving strikes within Venezuelan territory by the Trump administration, whether under the guise of combating drugs? It's funny that we're bringing back the war on drugs that worked so great in the past, right?
Sure. One thing the U.S., the neocon wing of the U.S. uniparty government is not particularly good at is learning lessons of the past. They tend to repeat a lot of mistakes. There's absolutely going to be a kinetic conflict between the U.S. and the Maduro regime. There will be efforts to do a regime change operation. They'll turn Venezuela into Libya. It'll be a disaster. Sure, that's all coming. We've seen this play dozens of times. When you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem. And so, there's going to be some bombs dropped on Venezuela. United Nations members will cry outrage. The U.S. will ignore it. Sorry if I sound a little skeptical or cynical, I guess I should say. But it's hard not to be sometimes.
Yeah, I totally get that sentiment. I want to talk about U.S. oil production because they've consistently been one of the top oil producers in the world, frequently taking the number one spot on an annual basis. Trump came into office with a drill baby drill mentality, but with WTI crude now hovering around $63 and change, a lot of companies are not able to make much of a profit at these prices. In addition, several analysts have been pointing out that the shale fields in the U.S. are starting to enter a decline phase and hint that perhaps the U.S. will eventually lose its status as a major producer. Does the oil price need to go higher to incentivize companies to extract? And what is your current view on projections for U.S. oil production moving forward?
The view that the U.S. shale is going into decline and the U.S. will cease to be a major producer, I would characterize that as nonsense. The U.S. has certain bottlenecks that once relieved, the spice will flow. So let's talk about oil. There's been a sea change in the U.S. energy markets because of shale, driven predominantly by the co-production of natural gas liquids, and oil in places like the Permian. So when you talk about the break-even price of oil in the Permian, you are talking about a number that no longer matters. The break-even price of oil, NGLs, and natural gas combined is what matters because you're dealing with all three of them at the wellhead. And so today in the Permian, natural gas prices, or at least recently, were negative again. And that's because there's been some, unscheduled maintenance and a force majeure on a pipeline, and it's running so tight. Yeah, so at the Waha Hub right now, the spot price of natural gas is minus $1.33 per million BTU. The price of oil is only one input into a complex equation that will determine the volumes which can be produced. If natural gas in the Permian today were $5 a million BTU, 12-month strip, you could hedge it out, the oil would become the nuisance byproduct that people would look to give away. So, there is no longer a break-even price of oil. There's a break-even price of oil, NGLs, and natural gas. The bottleneck in the Permian is natural gas offtake capacity. Pipelines are being built. The moment they're built, they're full. There's so much gas that the country can't get rid of it. Over time, that will all get worked out. But there's been a total sea change in the U.S. energy sector. And we've written many pieces on this. We just wrote one called Shale Gas Arithmetic. There is an infinite supply of natural gas in the U.S. It's all about price, Jesse. And, with the 12-month strip of, $3.50 Henry Hub right now, that's the equivalent of, what, $18 a barrel, $20 a barrel oil. you get that up to 5 or 6, and there's just going to be an avalanche, a tsunami of natural gas that hits the market, which is going to make the price of oil irrelevant.
Very interesting thoughts. And speaking of pipelines being built, I'm wondering what you make of the MOU signed between Russia and China, giving China access to natural gas from the new Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, and increasing volume already incoming from Power of Siberia 1. A lot of people are pointing out that this is natural gas that could have been flowing to EU countries as they continue to experience a massive spike in their energy costs. What are your thoughts on this MOU and its potential implications on the global stage?
Yeah, that's a big deal. It's about 5 BCF per day. And just to benchmark you, the US is currently producing 107 BCF per day of natural gas. It tells us two things. The world is bifurcating between the G7 US-led Western financial system countries and the Global South BRICS SCO, and Russia is going to power China, India, with its partners in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But the second and most consequential thing is it isolates Europe. I mean, Europe has it is by far the biggest loser of the last 5 years. Its entire economic system has been undercut. It traded cheap, plentiful, reliable natural gas via pipeline from Russia for expensive American LNG. It is deindustrializing at a rapid, alarming clip, and it is undergoing massive political upheaval that Brussels is trying to do its best to keep a lid on, but we think ultimately that's going to boil over into revolutions and ultimately the end of the European Union itself. Now, this is not all because of the Power Siberia 2. The Power Siberia 2 is a symptom of the greater disease. In this case, the European Union having no idea how to manage its energy portfolio or how critical fundamental energy is to their economic strength and of course, by definition, then their geopolitical strength, because one is just a derivative of the other. So the natural gas for Power Siberia 2 comes from Yamal, the Arctic, and that gas was going to Europe, and now it's going to go to China. And by the way, once pipelines are built, as I'm sure you know, expanding them, maintaining them, comparatively simple tasks. This will have a bearish impact on LNG markets post 2030. There's an awful lot of LNG coming to the market right now. There's just so much natural gas in the world, Jesse. Everywhere, you poke a hole in the ground and there's gas coming out of it. And so, we're going to see Russia fueling the 7 billion in the global south, along with its partners. And we're seeing, basically the rest of the world hooked on US energy.
Well, you brought up the collapse of the EU at some point, so I have to just get your thoughts quickly on, the recent elimination of the AfD candidate from a mayoral election in Germany. I'm not sure exactly what the jurisdiction was, but 3 separate courts, I believe, convened to eliminate the AfD candidate from the election. They only had something like a 26% voter turnout, and it should be noted that the AfD candidate was leading in the polls. That's got to be it for democracy or any semblance of it in Germany, right? Because if they can do this for a mayoral election, then they can just do it for any election that takes place and just completely eliminate every AfD candidate that's trying to run. What are your thoughts there?
So this is an EU problem, not a Germany problem. Whenever you hear Ursula von der Leyen or any of her minions use the phrase our democracy, the emphasis is on our and not democracy. Our democracy means rule by dictate out of Brussels. So they stole the election in Romania. I think that's not a controversial thing. Apparently, they keep charging him with crimes. The name of the candidate who was going to win in a landslide, his name escapes me now.
Georgescu.
Georgescu, that's right. Everywhere you look, Austria, populist right-leaning party wins, and they don't allow him to form a government. Controversial election in Poland. couple of years ago where Donald Tusk won, quote unquote. I think there's an awful lot of creative vote counting going on in Europe, if you ask me. The 7 mysterious deaths of regional candidates from the AFD just before the elections a couple of weeks ago. A lot of stories right now about how Russia's flooding the field in Czech Republic with their elections coming up. There's a big election in Moldova this weekend. You know, a lot of interference from the EU. It just has to be said, the European Union, the European Commission, is anti-democratic. It's borderline totalitarian. It is not serving the people of Europe well at all. It is a giant bloating bureaucracy that exists to grow and to serve itself. And the quicker the European Union falls apart, the better for the people of Europe. Find me a leader in Europe, sort of the globalist wing of the European leaders, who's popular. Macron, 15% approval rate. Starmer, even though the UK is not formally in the European Union, Starmer's doing his best to get Britain back into it for sure. What's his popularity? 13%, 12%. Who elected van der Leyen? You know, all across Europe, with a few exceptions, obviously Hungary, Slovakia. But it's breaking apart at the seams. Look, Hungary and Slovakia are not going to quit Russian oil and gas. They can't. You're asking the leaders of sovereign nations to impale themselves in the name of some Brussels adventure. It's just not going to happen. People aren't going to put up with it. So we'll see. I think Moldova is the next hotspot. You're going to see headlines next week. You know, Transnistria is there, which is quasi-Russian territory. There's all manner of historical grievances that are about to be laid bare. The European Union can't keep all of these plates spinning indefinitely.
I want to talk about a piece you wrote on the blackouts in Spain in April titled Fessing Up, where you wrote, after Spain, the true cost of solar can no longer be hidden from the public. Walk us through why you think an over-reliance on solar energy caused this blackout and why the Spanish prime minister was so eager to dismiss that theory, calling it misinformation, I believe.
Yeah, misinformation, the meaning of that word is undergoing a semantic shift. Misinformation now means things our ruling elite don't want you to hear, regardless of whether they're true. It was always known that if you overload a grid with too much solar, you become susceptible to the types of blackouts that we saw in Spain. What happened? There was a fault at a solar plant, and because the grid was so overloaded with solar in that moment, it did not have sufficient inertia to override that fault, and the whole grid collapsed. So what do I mean by inertia? If you go to a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant, you see giant spinning turbines that are ultimately creating the electricity, right? Those turbines, you know, a body in motion likes to stay in motion. Those spinning turbines don't just stop on a dime, and they often override those faults. Small faults. They impose a mirage of linearity on what is an utterly chaotic, you know, sensitive to initial conditions type system. And solar doesn't have spinning turbines, doesn't have much in the way of moving parts at all. Solar is what's known as an inverter-based resource. We wrote about this several times. We've warned about it. Many people have warned about it. And so in order to make a grid capable of operating that much solar, you need to have artificial inertia. You have big, giant spinning turbines, synchronous turbines on standby, which cost a lot of money, which is why people don't like to do it up front, right? So solar is inherently expensive to use when managing a grid because it is intermittent. There's three major types of power sources that a grid manager needs to consider. There's base load, 24/7, always on. There's dispatchable, which means you can control how much electricity is coming from that source over a span of minutes, i.e. easily dial it up or dial it down. And then there's intermittent, which is just unpredictable. So you can be both base load and dispatchable. So natural gas is both baseload and dispatchable. Nuclear and coal, while they have some dispatchability, you kind of want to run those plants 24/7. And then intermittency. So whenever solar decides to show up, you need to have dispatchable power to turn down. And when solar decides not to show up, you have to have dispatchable power to cover for solar. Well, that's expensive, right? So yes, the sun is free, but it's not free to use. And as a general rule, we laid all this out in a presentation we gave to our subscribers called Cocktail Party Trivia, Winning the Renewables Debate with Friends and Family. Whenever intermittency exceeds dispatchability, things begin to break. And so it's just everywhere you look, more solar, more expensive. I don't know how much more evidence you need, especially once you cross a critical threshold. Look, India, barely 7% electricity from solar. It's all concentrated in a few regions. It's overwhelmed their grid. They have grid issues. They're curtailing solar. China is running into similar problems. California, of course, is a basket case. The most expensive electricity in the US. The US Northeast running into it again. Germany, of course, the entire European Union. Over and over and over again, this is exactly what we see. And now you can't hide it. They're fessing up. Like, yeah, well, we need to make, in that piece, I believe we quoted the UN Secretary General as saying, for every dollar of solar, we need to invest at least $1 into the grid so that the grids can use solar. Okay, so the capital cost of solar is now twice what you've been telling us. Sold. Understood. Thank you. So, there's two ways to find these things out. You could read Doomberg, you could listen to Jesse's podcast, or you could go ahead and overbuild solar and then wreck your economy. And it seems like far too many countries are taking the second approach. The last thing I'd say is, wish I could have been in the room at the United Nations yesterday when Trump was calling, climate change and green energy a scam. Right in the underbelly of the globalist movement.
So with all these problems you've outlined, and obviously there's been a big pushback, and even, people like the IEA are starting to wake up a little bit and say, okay, actually, maybe we're going to need more oil in the future than we thought. Do you think we're getting past peak ESG in terms of political class pounding the table about reducing global oil and coal production to zero, forcing everybody to drive an EV? Is that starting to get played out at this point? Or do you think these people are going to clutch on to that ideology, to whatever the consequence?
So we called peak ESG in December of 2023 after COP28. And I think if we go back to that piece that we wrote, our predictions in this regard have played out, although Trump has certainly accelerated. That's all going to get washed away by physics. We study energy pretty carefully. The Statistical Review of World Energy is sort of the Bible. 2024 numbers just came out in June. Record coal production, record natural gas production, record oil production. We're doing a Doom Zoom presentation that we'll release next week called Losing India, what BRICS unity means for geopolitics and energy. And India is investing a huge amount in coal. It's desperately short oil, so it's going to make it up by producing an enormous, I think there are like 300 new mines coming online. China, subject of our next piece, is building out huge coal to chemicals on a scale that is actually material to oil. Look, you can make jet fuel, diesel, and gasoline from any hydrocarbon. You just make syngas and go from there. And China's doing it at scale. The Germans did it in World War II. South Africans had to do it during the apartheid sanctions. They still do it today. Sasol has a huge coal to chemicals plant. China is burning an enormous amount of coal to make oil products, to wean itself off of its oil dependency. All of these things are sort of predictably driven by arbitrage and national security, things that obviously European leaders have no concept of. And the global south is not going to forego its development in the name of climate change.
The latest example, perhaps, of this ESG mania rearing its head still, although, as you mentioned, you think that it peaked in 2023, was, Austria and Luxembourg back in 2022 filed a lawsuit against the EU to try and annul nuclear energy and natural gas from the sustainable finance taxonomy. This month, the General Court dismissed the challenge. But of course, because these people do not learn, as you mentioned, Austria is moving to appeal to the European Court of Justice. I mean, is this just a matter of the political class in Austria benefiting financially from solar and wind projects and fearing an end to that gravy train? Is it just complete incompetence or something else in your view?
It's religious fanaticism. By the way, Austria is one of the countries where a plurality of the people voted for the opposite of this policy, but they could never form a government. And so now you have the representatives of Austria pursuing this utterly insane policy. There is no path to reasonable prosperity based on wind, solar, and batteries. There just isn't. By the way, it's something that we've borrowed from the author of the Manhattan Contrarian, excellent blog. Like, why don't we just build a demo? Let's build a city, 10,000 people. You're only allowed to have wind, solar, and batteries. Let's see. Build a grid, operate the grid. Let's see what the price is. Let's see how stable it is. Let's do it. Run the pilot. You know, in industry, you go from lab to pilot to market development scale to a small commercial plant before you build the big, large commercial plant. Like, pretty well-known steps. We're talking about spending trillions of dollars without even running a small pilot. Like, the fact that that experiment hasn't been done proves to you why it hasn't been done. Because it would flop. Like, just take any community, 10,000, build it from scratch. And then that grid can only have wind, solar, and batteries. For example, if California were not connected to other states, and if California was a standalone grid, that grid would have collapsed long ago. When the sun doesn't show up, its neighbors bail California out. And then, ironically, when the sun does show up now, California produces way too much electricity and dumps it at rock bottom prices to its neighbors because it has to put it somewhere. It's insane what California has done. And the only thing that has bailed out California is its connections to other states via transmission lines. Let's build an island. Let's power it with solar, wind turbines, and all the batteries you want. Now, we have to add up the costs. We have to do an honest accounting of the costs. Then let's see whether you can operate a grid at reasonable price with, 5 nines stability that industry requires.
They could do it in Liberland, which is right on the border here with Serbia and Croatia. It's its own little country that is currently undeveloped. So, I mean, the perfect plot of land to attempt this experiment. Why not?
Look, I mean, just take $20 billion and build a city for 10,000 people from scratch. Like, who cares? Before you spend trillions, I'd like to see the experiment done, please.
The Department of Energy in the United States has recently been pushing for more domestic uranium production, more nuclear reactors in the US. Currently, the US grid is powered by around 20% nuclear and yet has no sizable domestic uranium production to speak of. With around 250 tons produced in 2024. Meanwhile, China is planning 150 reactors by 2035, produce 1,700 tons in 2024. Of course, in addition to their strong cooperation with Kazatomprom in Kazakhstan, the world's largest uranium producing region. Clearly, this is a race where China is so far ahead, it's very difficult to catch up. But do you think the Trump administration can make a meaningful impact here when it comes to domestic nuclear power production and uranium extraction?
Yeah, so minor correction. Uranium extraction is nowhere near rate limiting. What's rate limiting is uranium enrichment. The US is currently relying on Russia for the majority of its enriched uranium, and the US can enrich uranium. This is a $10 billion check, set it in, forget it trade. And yes, the Trump administration is not only capable of solving it, but they will solve it. And they're probably already well on their way to solving it. Secretary of Energy Chris Wright is a very knowledgeable man. He's very successful businessman. And literally, if the US military has lost its ability to enrich uranium, then we got much bigger problems than keeping the lights on. So this, to me, has always been a bit of an overblown, sort of classic Twitter concept. Oh, we're rely on Russia to enrich uranium. If the U.S. can't enrich uranium, I mean, give me a break. So this is a check measured in single-digit billions, and so the U.S. military understands this. This will get solved rather quickly. All shortages create gluts, and so to the extent that there's an artificial shortage, look, Russia has been a very good supplier of this material. They've not threatened to cut it off, despite everything that has been going on between Europe and the U.S. and Russia, contrary to how things are portrayed. And so this is not something that keeps me up at night, but it's important to distinguish between uranium and enriched uranium. And, it's kind of like distinguishing between oil and gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. If the refiners went down, the price of oil would collapse because oil is worthless until it arrives at a refinery. It's just mud before it gets to a refinery. And so similarly with uranium, if it can't be enriched, you don't have much use for it, right? And so it's the enrichment step that is rate limiting. It's the one that is relatively easy to solve. There's nothing in the way of technology that needs to be invented. This is a financial constraint. And one thing I will tell you, based on our channel checks and industry partners, is the U.S. government is deadly serious about weaning the country off of all dependency on China, and money will be spent on this problem. So this isn't China per se, it's Russia, but it is irresponsible to be basically sole supplied a critical aspect of the uranium fuel cycle to Russia when it's, significant portion of your electricity supply. So that will be solved. That one doesn't keep us up at night.
Well, I have to get your thoughts on gold here before I let you go, breaking up to new all-time highs after being in around a 4-month consolidation pattern. Silver as well, currently outperforming gold this year and looking like it could be ready to rip higher. What is your assessment of both precious metals and their trajectory moving forward?
Yeah, we spend a lot more time thinking about gold than we do silver. I know some friends who are long silver. I hope it goes to the moon. I'd like to see my friends make money. I don't own any meaningful silver. I have, a couple of hundred silver eagles in a safe somewhere in case the what hits the fan and I need to do some bartering. My theory is that people will way overvalue a silver coin in such a scenario, and maybe I'll get some bread for it. But I think about gold a lot more, and I think gold is returning to its rightful place as eventually the most important neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. U.S. Treasuries and European debt are no longer neutral. It can't be argued that they're neutral. And so the world runs on a neutral reserve asset, and gold is going to be that asset. And I think gold needs to be a lot higher for it to properly serve that role, for the global south at least. And who gets hurt if the gold price goes up? That's an interesting question. The U.S. could use the gold price to go up so it could revalue its gold and free up some room for Scott Bessent over at Treasury. Everybody's balance sheet gets better when gold goes up. And so, I think we own some. It's a savings vehicle. It's not an investment. When gold goes up too quickly, it bothers me. But gold has been kind of going up in a straight line since the war in Ukraine, basically. And I think that's not a coincidence.
Well, Doomberg, fantastic conversation as always. Tell us about the Doomberg Substack.
Yeah, and I got another product to pitch too, if you don't mind. So obviously you can find
Absolutely.
all of our work at Doomberg.com, but we've also launched a sister publication. One of the Doomberg co-founders and its editor-in-chief has launched a new Substack called Classics Read Aloud, classicsreadaloud.substack.com. As the name implies, it's a fun project. She's very passionate about great literature, and it's a really great product. We're super proud of it. We just launched it September 1st. It's been growing like gangbusters. If you want to see the full breadth of the Doomberg team, head over to classicsreadaloud.substack.com. Jesse, always a pleasure. When I see your email request to come on your show, I'm always excited because I know we're going to have a great conversation.
Thank you for joining us today. This episode is brought to you by ARC Silver Gold, osmium, some of the best prices out there. They are displayed on screen right now. Take advantage today by reaching out to owner Ian Everard at 307-264-9441 or by email at ian@arcsgo.com. Make sure to tell him that Commodity Culture sent you, and of course, pick up your Commodity Culture merch using the link in the description below. Everything backed by a 100% quality Guarantee, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.